So this is the last few stages of psychosexual development, and now we're at the latency stage. This is part 2, Introduction to Counseling, Psychoanalysis, and Psychodynamic Psychotherapy. A brief introduction. So in the latency stage, which is, he said, between 6 and 12, sexuality goes beneath the surface. It's not so obvious. And the energy is focused on schoolwork, academics, friendships, peer activities, those kinds of things. Physical skills. Little interest, little manifested interest, despite the fact that the id is still a strongly sexual power within the individual. So everything's beneath the surface. Then in the genital stage, he thought that if all had gone well and you didn't get stuck or fixated in any of the previous stages, that you reached puberty and you began to take a more mature interest, for example, in members of the opposite sex. Although I'm here to tell you that Freud, even Freud, did not think homosexuality was an illness. He thought it was simply a variation in the human population. But this interest in mature sex has to do with intercourse and not specifically masturbation. If there were unresolved difficulties in any of the previous stages, it would make reaching this stage and developing a mature interest in the opposite sex and in intercourse, that would make that very difficult. Okay? Wow. Now, I want you to know that this stuff is way more complicated than I'm making it. And I have a little bit more than what I'm telling you in my brain about this, but not at great depth, which is some of the depth that you would see if you studied this in translations from his works, which I encourage. Interpretation of Dreams would be the one I'd pick if I had to. So he had defense mechanisms, which are things that we recognize now as being existent. We think they do exist. We don't know where in the personality those reside. We're not necessarily, in most clinicians' minds, thinking that it has to do with ego protection and so on. But it's protective in some ways. We tend to, in his mind anyway, protect us from anxiety by adapting to situations in ways that make it through those anxiety-provoking situations, or through the distortion or denial of those events. He said these are normal. We think in modern thinking, other than psychoanalytic thought and psychodynamic thought, that these do exist, as I said, but he thought they operated completely unconsciously. I think they operate automatically. I don't know that that's the same thing as unconsciously. Okay. Now, what's really fascinating and difficult to explain, and which I will not explain, is probably because it's so in-depth and takes so much time and I'm not that great at it, is that fixation, which may occur in any of the psychosexual stages, can result in different patterns that emerge in adulthood as to which defense mechanisms you are more likely to use. Okay? Now, what are some common defense mechanisms? Repression is the most common one, he thought. Everything that was conflictual or difficult became repressed, which is automatically and motivatingly cast into the unconscious. Projection, which is basically not owning a difficult feeling of your own or a difficult idea and casting it onto someone else and seeing it in someone else so that you are blind to seeing it in yourself. Reaction formation, which is vehemently standing up against something that is actually an internal force within you to do or to think or to fantasize about. An example would be someone who rails against homosexuality and thinks it's horrible and so on, and then you find out, or the person acknowledges later perhaps, that actually they have a lot of fantasies or desires to be engaged in homosexual behavior, or feels that they may be homosexual or are. So another one is displacement. That's where you don't or can't take out aggression or sexuality on some person X, so you take it out on person or thing Y. You displace it onto something or someone else. And then regression, which is moving backwards temporarily in a emotional way to an earlier life stage to get through it. Rationalization, which is justifying personal behavior that is absolutely not okay otherwise. Denial is very primitive. It is a way to not see something or consciously be able to accurately interpret someone. So part or all of that thing becomes something you can't see or know consciously to protect you from it. Humor is considered high level, a high level defense mechanism, and what that means is that you, in the presence of anxiety in interrelationships or situations, that you tell jokes or you see the lighter side so as to defer anxiety that you and others may have. And then sublimation, which is, as I mentioned earlier in this video, first video, doing things that are activities which are socially acceptable to take the place of things that are socially less acceptable. Okay. Well, these appear to be, as I said, truly observable in people, in adults, and they are useful in coping with unexpected or disappointing or dreadful events. But they might also make situations worse. They can make, if you're somebody who tends to use an intellectual style, or you tend to use humor, for example, that can go wrong in many places, can't it? Now, one of the ways that he got at this unconscious material that we've talked about is through dream analysis. So I want to talk for a minute about how that works. So something to remember is that psychoanalysis is a process that goes on for sometimes years, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. It's very expensive and time-consuming. His original work was with neurotic or anxious upper-class females, and of course that population is more occupied by people who can take that time and spend that money and are likely to talk more, usually. And so he had a group of patients that were amenable to the kinds of things that he would do as techniques. And one of those was dream analysis, in which he worked to, over a long period of time, not suddenly, transform symbols that were either direct representations of reality that the person had experienced that day or something, and symbolic, which were things that stood for other things in your dreams. So he thought that dreams were repressed thoughts and feelings that came up during work, that bubbled up out of the unconscious. It's an interesting idea. Modern ideas about what dreams are do not include that. But the content of dreams, either symbolic or apparent, sometimes called manifest, are bewildering to the average person. So would have been to a patient, or are to a patient. Yeah, probably 3 to 5% worldwide of therapists use psychoanalysis, more common in Europe, as you might expect. So the analyst would study content of dreams and interpret symbols over a long period of time, looking for patterns and linking them to the conflicts of the individuals, looking to see what conflicts emerge from these patterns, and putting all these different things together, some of which we have yet to talk about. So dreams, as you know, are a visual medium. They are visual. So when we put someone in an MRI, functional MRI, and if they're sleeping, then we see the occipital lobe, which is back here, lighting up, and parts of the cognitive processing lighting up. So we are literally observing our own visual medium, I guess, when we're dreaming. And dreams, the most vivid ones, the most prolific ones are in REM sleep about every 90 minutes, rapid eye movement sleep. You can have dreams in other stages like 3 and 4, but the REM sleep is the one where you have most of them. Okay, so in terms of interpretation, he didn't really believe in a dreamer's dictionary, but he did find certain items that were represented in the same way by different people. Houses, for example, with a human form. If you dreamed about royalty, you might be talking about parents. In terms of, if you saw tiny animals, that would be siblings. I'm not sure where that one comes from. Umbrellas and sticks and so on were phalluses, and pits and caves and jars and so on were female sex organs, and then fruits and then dancing and riding and climbing through windows, and that's sex. Even violent acts were thought to be sexual by him. So in our last part 3 video, we're going to talk about the last bits of psychoanalysis, and I'll see you in a moment.